Okay, so for this video, I'm going to be working in a different project file that I have. One thing I mentioned in that video explaining the final project is that a great way to learn Revit is to recreate buildings that you are interested in or admire, because it gives you kind of some interesting problems that you aren't typically used to doing, and then gives you pointed questions to have to search for. So this is a project that I had worked on for the Eames residence. It's now a museum, but Charles and Ray Eames were designers and architects, and this was a house that they created. And so I recreated it in Revit just as something to help me learn about curtain walls because the house is a lot of curtain walls, and I learned a lot about structural stuff and searching for different components. And so it's just a file that I had around and I thought would be a good one to help show some things with cameras and walkthroughs and things like that. Um, so I have the file here. Also, just as a note too, if your computer ever starts getting really laggy when you have projects, particularly when there's lots of components in them, hiding things can be very helpful. So for example, here, if I reveal my hidden elements, I have a lot of trees on here because it's kind of built into this forested area in California, and that's just a little bit too much for my computer to handle, so I just have all of the tree components hidden, so that way when I'm in the 3D view, things don't get incredibly laggy for me, particularly since this is also a computer that's kind of made to do graphical work and CAD work. All of the components that are inside my PC were picked to do that stuff, so if things are laggy on my end, I can probably imagine then maybe something like this for a file that, or a file like this on, one of your computers that maybe isn't made for something like doing this CAD and Revit work, how laggy it could be. Um, so first off, to place a camera, I do not place cameras in the three-dimensional view just because it's a nightmare. I don't know if you even could. Let's try. Let's try. Let's learn together. So there's two ways I could place a camera. One way is, or the way I prefer to do it, is right through this quick toolbar. If I just click on that little arrow next to 3D view, there is a button to place cameras. The other way I could get to the camera button is through the view tab. And then just like with AutoCAD, anytime you see those little down arrows, that means that there's other options. So there's a camera button right here. And it looks like you can place a camera in a 3D view, so we can see that we have that little camera icon next to my cursor, and I can place it and place the camera, and then this is kind of like the cone of vision, and it's just asking what do you want it to look at, so I can look at it this way or move my cursor over here and then click to place it, and my camera's placed. Right now this is just a big tree that I happen to place it directly almost inside of. So I can, a lot of times with cameras, you have to kind of hide some things, so I can right click and hide this element because maybe I do want some of these other trees in there. So I've learned that I can place cameras from three-dimensional view, but I really don't like doing that. So I'm just going to click on this view here and just delete it, purely because I like placing cameras from floor plans themselves. So I'm going to go into my first floor plan here and place my camera just from this view in particular. Now, one thing to keep in mind too is if I show my crop region, when I go to place a camera, so if I come here, camera, it'll show me the little camera thing next to my cursor. The minute I move out of my crop region, that camera icon goes away, but I still can place it. So I still can click over here to place my camera, and then once I have my cone of vision kind of where I want it to be, click again, and it'll make the three-dimensional or make the camera view. So you can place outside of that crop region and still have everything be kind of the way you want it to. These little control points here is you can essentially just click and drag to change what you're looking at. And then of course too, like I said, you can hide things. So for instance, this tree is in my way right now, so I can right click on it, hide, and remember hiding an element hides just that one particular thing versus hiding a category would hide all my trees, which is something I don't really want to do for this particular view. I just kind of want to hide some of these, so I'll just right click, hide element. I'll keep this one here just so I can see kind of what it looks like. Maybe there are some other components. I know for a fact that some of these components don't render very well, which is what I'm going to kind of go over next, but that's okay just for this demo. Now, before I do any renderings or anything, sorry, lost my train of thought. Before I do any renderings, there's a few things that I want to check with my camera just because renderings can take quite some time. And one is again that just everything is kind of positioned the way I want it to. So I can pan my view around when looking at my camera. I can just click on the edge of it and change just those like views. So maybe I want less ground showing or things like that. What I don't want to do with a camera view though is orbit. And that's because placing a camera automatically puts you in a 2-point perspective. So we can see here that my lines are running towards a vanishing point on a horizon line that's probably like out all the way out, even further off screen. But these two on this side are going towards that vanishing point. On this side, we're going towards a vanishing point. Again, that's way off screen. The camera in Revit takes care of that for us already. I could change some things regarding like the height for eyesight. So if I wanted to maybe make it that my camera was a little bit further up, so I could change it to, 10 foot in the air, and now I'm further up. I can change kind of if I'm looking down or above at my object. I kind of liked that 5'6" one. It's kind of just, almost at eye level. I know many of us aren't 5'6", but that's kind of a nice generic eye level for me, so I kind of like this. But you can change that around. You can also change the view itself to be kind of an orthographic of just a head-on, or that perspective, which is what I prefer when I'm doing cameras for renderings. But again, depends maybe what we're working on. And before I do a rendering, I like to just double check all of my materials. So I'm going to change my visual style to consistent colors. So this just kind of shows me some of the colors that I have associated with things. The problem with consistent colors in some aspects is that it's only going to show up if you applied it when you change that material around. So for example, with all of these curtain walls I have in here, if I right click and say select mullions on the host, and why isn't it letting me change the mullions? Maybe if I just select one particular one, there we go, edit type, go to material here, change its material. So I have in my actual physical rendering appearance, I've applied a tint to this, so that way it's a black color. So that way when I do a rendering, these mullions in the curtain wall are black, because that's what they are in the building themselves. However, in consistent colors, I didn't change anything about this render appearance or change what color they show up. So that's why they don't look black. I can change this here. So that way now I click OK and I click OK. Now they all become black. But that's just because it wasn't something that I had changed in here. So consistent colors is a good way to just check some things right off the bat. Anytime you see this kind of darker gray color, that's typically a note that that is a material that you never altered or changed, and that it's in there as something generic. But it could also just be that you didn't check off a particular scenario. So another ultimate thing that I recommend you check before doing a rendering is changing it over to this realistic, which sometimes can take a bit to load, just because it's loading in all of those different textures and patterns. and maybe some of them are custom ones that you loaded in. Particularly for me with this project, this is a pretty hefty project, like I've mentioned before. Um, and so then I can kind of just double check that I've got materials where I want them to be. I'm noticing that here we're coming out a little bit gray, but that's all right. Maybe I do have a material there, or it could be, I think actually what happened is that's a custom material I made, but I no longer have the image that it's referencing. And I'm not going to bother loading it in just for this demo. Um, but you can kind of just check some of maybe those custom textures you've loaded in or anything that you might have changed to make sure everything's looking the way you want it to. Um, so now that I know realistically everything is looking around how I'd like it to be, I can create a render. So let me go into the View tab, and then I have options to render in the program or render in cloud, and we'll go over kind of what the two differences are going to be. So if I click on just a render, I get some of my options here in which I can change the quality. So before you ever do any of these other quality of renderings, I always recommend doing a draft one because again, that's going to show sometimes just some of those ugly generic grays or maybe places that you forgot to add materials. And a draft render will run the absolute fastest. The higher quality you put, the longer a rendering will take. And again, that also is going to depend on just like the graphics card and the RAM, as well as just your CPU. So all of those things combined are going to depend on how fast your rendering will run. If you're on just kind of a more generic-y style laptop that wasn't made to do graphics-based stuff, renders can take hours. So when I first learned Revit, all the way back further than I'd care to admit, it's because I'm starting to feel old, but when I first learned Revit and I was just doing it kind of based on my generic Dell Latitude laptop, I did a rendering and I remember it took 4 hours for the rendering to run. Um, Now, I didn't just sit on my computer and stare at it for 4 hours. I sat and I did my laundry, I watched some Netflix, I did work for other classes, but the thing is, when Revit is rendering something in the software, you can't do anything else in Revit. You have to sit and wait for it to finish. Um, so that's why it's always a good idea to do a draft rendering first, so that this way, if there is something wrong, you didn't waste 4 hours. The next thing you can also play around with is your lighting. So because this is an exterior view of my house, I'm just going to make sure that I'm doing an exterior rendering. If I was inside the house, I'd probably want to do an interior rendering. Makes sense. Um, and the difference then, of course, between those two that we can see in those settings is that there's sun and artificial or doing both. Um, Anytime you are using artificial lighting in there, it's going to take longer to render. And that's because it has to think about the lights that you have inside the building and how they would glow and how that light would dissipate as it gets further away from the source. In like your small building extra credit, and even in the Revit project, we didn't place any lights in there. We didn't put any lighting systems in the building. And so therefore, there is no reason to put artificial lights in there because it'll still try to render all the artificial lights. It'll still take more time, but nothing's there. So don't run an artificial light rendering in there. I'm just going to do an exterior sun only. You can play around with the solar settings that I went over in the project, um, in some of the videos for the Revit project, and then also next week we'll go over kind of playing around with some of those sun settings. So for example, in this project, um, I have my solar settings placed for where this building is, since this is an actual building. I placed it so that the sun was for where it is in California, and that way I could get the most realistic settings and things like that. But I'm just going to leave that alone for in here. And you can change the background as well. So this big white space up here is going to get rendered with a sky. I can change how I have the settings of that sky set. I can make it just one particular color. I can make it a picture. So if I have a specific image of a skyline or a background, if maybe I'm rendering a building that's in a city, I can put kind of some of the backgrounds of that city skyline in there to help make it blend in. Or I can make it transparent. So if it's a file or a render that I'm planning on bringing into Photoshop to then further kind of manipulate and change around some more, I will usually leave that background as transparent or not image, or I'll make it a solid color and I'll choose like a color that'll be very easy for me to isolate and then be replaced with another picture itself. So if it's something that I'm going to take this picture, put it somewhere else, I'll do that transparent or I'll do just one solid color. For this, I'm not going to do either of those things, so I'm just going to leave it at that sky. You know what? I'll even make it cloudy. And I'm just going to do a draft rendering, and I'm going to render it and then just let it run through. So right now, as it's rendering, I can see down here just kind of a little progress bar that's going. I can't do anything else while it's doing this, so I just kind of have to sit there and wait. It used to be that a little bar would pop up here telling you how much time has passed. Apparently in 2021, we don't do that anymore, but that's okay. And what I'll do is I'm just going to pause and unpause when my rendering's done. Oh wait, never mind. Here we go. Oh yeah, okay, it does pop up. It was just processing it first. Um, so right now it's just warning me that these are some pictures that I had associated with different parts of the building or different materials, and it's just saying that we couldn't put those pictures in here. And my rendering is finished because this is a computer again that was made to do this type of graphic work. The draft rendering took maybe a minute to do. And it is just kind of showing me some areas where it's like, okay, that picture isn't showing up. A material that I had applied here is also not showing up. So again, rather than wasting my time to do a much longer rendering that I could have lost a lot of time with, I'm able to see those issues right away, go and fix them, and then do one of my more finalized renderings. With this draft rendering, I have a lot less quality. So that's why like it's kind of this weird little static for the grass. Same thing here on this like planter and with some of the trees. My quality is pretty low, but I was able to get done a lot faster. The higher I put these settings, the better my image will look, but the longer it'll take. So when I'm doing something like this best setting rendering, this is the type that's going to take hours to do, especially with a file like this. With maybe like our Revit project or our small building, we could do a best rendering and it would take, again, it's going to depend on the computer, but it will take maybe around 10 minutes to do. With something like this, where it is this heavily detailed, lots of different materials going on, it'll take some hours to do. And with that, as a note, if you are using Udesk, if you are unresponsive in the Udesk window for too long, it logs you out, and that means then that your rendering will just get canceled, and also any progress you make on your file gets canceled too. So if you have a rendering going in Udesk, make sure that you are at least, playing around in Udesk. Maybe open up a tab of Netflix in Chrome on there and watch that so that this way you don't get logged out and lose your render, because I don't want that to happen to you. So like now I'll change my settings to medium. just so we can kind of see the difference between this and medium. I'll select render, and then I will unpause once it finishes. Okay, so it's done. It took me about 1.5 minutes, but again, my computer probably is a little bit faster than yours. I don't mean that as a flex because I didn't buy this computer, but and hopefully we can see now that there's a lot more detail getting included. The grass is looking a little less staticky. This planter looks a little bit better. Some of these plants look a little bit better. And just so the higher quality settings you have, the nicer your image will be, but again, the longer it'll take. You can also play around with the image exposure. So you can play around with some of these things to make the picture a little bit brighter. That's probably not, don't want it that bright, but I can play around with some of these settings. I can play around with adding in some highlights to it. I might need to adjust that a little bit more to actually show some differences. These are things that I'd probably play around with more so in Photoshop than in Revit itself, but even then I can just kind of play around with some of these just so we can see it a better. I'm not crazy about these colors, but I'll just leave it. And of course, too, if you mess everything up, you can always just hit reset and just go back to normal. The very important part about doing a render is after a render runs and you are satisfied with it, you gotta save it to your project. Because if I just X out of this, the rendering's gone. And that means, especially then if it's a rendering, that I sat for 2 hours for wait to it to complete, and I X out of it, and I lost it, well, that was essentially just 2 wasted hours of your whole project. So after you do a rendering, make sure you hit save to project, give it a name. I'll just call this one exterior demo. And now I can X out. It brings me back to just kind of the regular 3D camera, and it's made a new section in my project browser with renderings. And so now I have this picture saved. Sure, let's save the project. And we can see a couple of other renderings that I have here as well, which, let me just pause this because it's going to take forever to save. So I have these are just the 3D camera views that I've placed. So we can click on some of these. So I've got my 3-dimensional section, which actually isn't a camera view I have placed. It's just kind of a copy of this that I made with the section box. So that way I could easily why do I have this in realistic? That's the worst idea ever. So that way I could just kind of cut away at certain parts of my building. So I can easily just move that in and then kind of just see 3-dimensionally how everything's working through. And maybe click on certain things that I couldn't get to from an exterior position. Here's that camera that I just placed. Here's another camera view that I placed inside this time to kind of look at some of the interiors. Like some more interior stuff. So these are all just different cameras I have placed around the house. I do have some lighting in here, so when I did like this rendering, I did an interior one with artificial lighting. It does take longer to do things like that. Just an outside view, which I think looks very similar. Yeah, it's very similar to that one that we just placed, but this was a different one I did, and then just kind of from an overall. So these are just the 3-dimensional cameras that I placed. And then these are some of the renderings that I saved to the project. Looking at this now, I would 1000% change the exposure on here because, oh my God, this is so blinding and disgusting. But, I was learning. And again, I would probably put the darkness or change the exposure again. And so you can take these files then and you can bring them into other software to maybe make some improvements upon it, particularly with some of like this living room stuff. Maybe I couldn't get all of the furniture that I wanted, but then um, I could go and find images of those furniture and plop it into the rendering in like Photoshop or something like that to change everything around. The other thing to keep in mind with renderings is that you want to save them for last, and that's because any changes you make in the building do not show up in the render. So the render is a completely separate two-dimensional picture that has nothing to do with that linked 3D model. So, for example, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to completely delete this entire wall here, just get rid of it outside of my building. I'm going to go into my 3D view, click on this curtain wall, and I'm just going to delete just all of these. So this will update in my floor plan, and I'll get rid of this lounger. I'll get rid of this one. It'll update in my floor plan. It'll update in my elevations because everything is linked together, but it won't update in my rendering. So if I go into my living room rendering, that wall is still there. Any changes you make to your model don't get update in this 2D image. This is just a static raster image compared to your parametric 3D model. I'm now going to just go back into my 3D view and undo all that because I spent a lot of time on this project, and while I'm noticing all of the subtle uh-ohs that are currently in existence, I'm still pretty proud of what I did when I did this. So I don't want to erase any of that stuff. So yeah, your renderings, they should be kind of one of those last steps, especially because the rendering has no bearing on any of those construction documents. It's purely just something for kind of selling the project or maybe putting in for a competition or towards a client. So you want to make sure that you're kind of doing those in your last steps. Another thing that we can do with rendering is rendering in the cloud. Now, unless they've changed the way the educational accounts work, you you do get free credits for rendering in the cloud, but like I said, that could be different. So let me actually go into one of my three-dimensional views. I'll go into this entryway one, sure. And I could do a render in cloud. Now, you do have to be logged in to an Autodesk account, and since you had to download AutoCAD or Revit, you have an Autodesk account, and again, they are free to make. And it'll render it and then give you a link to it online. Now, if you don't have an educational account, you have to buy what are called render credits or cloud credits. I can't remember exactly the name, but that's not important. And you do have to be logged into your account in Revit. If you don't have an educational account, these do cost credits. So it is going to cost money potentially. So you can do just a still image, you can do a panorama, you can do a stereo one, which will allow us to kind of move around three-dimensionally. And then if you have something like Google Cardboard or really any kind of 3D or not 3D, what, not virtual, I guess virtual reality, kind of just any type of headset thing where you can put your phone into it or any type of output device. I'm just thinking of the fact that the way we use it in my class is we use Google Cardboard, and then I have a little, and then you could put the picture on a phone, you could stick it into a Google Cardboard thing. Google Cardboard's really cheap too, so just for our own little thing. Edumification, Google Cardboard. I forgot how much they cost, but they do not cost much at all. Apparently you can get even fancier viewers now. But yeah, like we bought just a bunch of them, kind of like this one where I don't even think they were $10 when we bought them. Uh, and you can just stick your phone in there and use it as like a 3D VR viewer. But you can do that. You can change your quality. So now see if I do a final quality, it's going to cost me 3 credits. So maybe they took away the free educational credits. So I'll just do standard. Uh, and I could change the size too, which that seems to, yeah, also bump up my credits. Uh, and it's just, I'm going to do this one with 0 credits, and I'll click on render, and it's just gathering some data, and then I'll get an email when this rendering is done. It's telling me that, again, that some of these images that I have associated with finishes aren't visible, and I'll just say that's fine. And I can continue in background. And now while it's rendering, and they'll email me when the render's done, I can still work around in this file. So it's not like doing a typical rendering in which I'm just kind of sitting there waiting for it to be able to finish the rendering so that way I can go do other things. Um, it's just going to run. Apparently it gives me a little update there too. Can I, whoops. It opened up a little link on my other screen for my rendering progress. And I want to see if my other rendering is associated in here. I don't think so because it was in a different account. But so it's running here with my renders, and I'm going to see if I can log into my old account and show you the renderings that I have from there. Okay, so I did get into my old account. I have no idea what this compost pile is, but a little scared to click on it to figure it out. So I have some renderings from that same project. From it looks like looks like I did a 360 rendering from here as well. Um, And what this does, it gives me this three-dimensional view in which I can either just click and drag myself around three-dimensionally in the building and look around. I am static in this one point, but I can still move myself around. And if I had this a like opened on my phone and in a Google Cardboard or some type of virtual reality viewer, if I moved my head up while I was looking through it, it would move up as well. So it kind of gives me a little 3D view. I'm not sure what this looks like. It's just from a different area. And so again, some of these textures, like these books on the shelf, the texture didn't load in well. And that's just because of where I got the files from. But again, I could still look around three-dimensionally, which is pretty cool. Um, I don't know what this is. I have no idea what I was doing here. I wish I did. I've done a bunch of projects with compost piles from grad school, so I have no idea what that is. Doesn't look like a compost pile to me. Maybe this was the with the you never mind. I'm not gonna waste your time with that. I'll figure that out on my own. And so then here too is what looks like I placed a camera and did a panoramic rendering of the small or the AutoCAD exercise, the Revit exercise. It just, I don't think I've ever opened it before. I think I just did it as a demo and then said, now it'll work. Um, yeah, so here I am just sitting at the corner of some barren wasteland, being able to kind of look around my project. Um, and so that again too with your site, sometimes you're going to have issues with your rendering because if your site isn't expanded enough to cover the where the sky ends or where the horizon line is, you're going to see some weird things. So that's just kind of playing around with where you have that camera and how you have it placed. And then sometimes just like with your materials. So I do have materials placed here on like the sides and everything. So those are then starting to come up, but I don't have any materials on those mullions. So they look a little bit weird and just kind of playing around with some of those things. but this just was in my old account, and then they changed the way educational accounts work, and they won't let me make this an educational account anymore because they realized that I graduated. And so they were like, hey, you're no longer a student. Um, and so, yeah, you can make some pretty cool panoramic account renderings in the cloud and still be able to work in Revit. The panoramic ones do take a pretty long time to render. Um, so you don't have to sit here and wait the entire time. That's why it will give you an email. And depending on how you have those settings done, it might cost money to do the renders, but that's just don't uh don't do one that costs money would be my suggestion, because you don't have to. Now, the last thing I want to kind of go over when it comes to some other, uh, I guess, imaging concepts is doing a walkthrough. So a walkthrough is, oh, and sorry, the other thing that you can also do is you can take these pictures here and you can export them. So I can take this picture, or rather, I would probably, just because I said I really don't like those ones, the exposure is just hideous on them, is I can go File, Export, Images, and then I can take the pictures or the renderings from my building and I can export them as just JPEGs that I then can put, like I said, into Photoshop or into InDesign. I can change where they're getting saved so that way I know where they are and they're easy for me to access. I can change the image file type as well. So I'll usually go with a JPEG or a PNG, but you can ultimately do whatever you want to. And that this way you can then further manipulate that in the software that's kind of better suited for manipulating 2D images. Revit really isn't meant to do something like that. Now, the other thing that you can do for creating some kind of, again, interesting pieces to help show in design competitions or to show clients or to show your professors would be to do walkthroughs. And a walkthrough essentially makes like a little movie of you stepping through your building, and they can be a little bizarre and a little particular to work with. And I'll be lying if I told you that I 1000% understand everything about walkthroughs, but I'll show you how I kind of work with them and figure them out and play around with them. So the walkthrough button is located the same way you find the camera. You can either be in the View tab and come to your 3D view and start a walkthrough, or from the quick toolbar, you can click on that little arrow and open up the walkthrough option. So what you're doing with a walkthrough is you're essentially placing tiny little cameras around your building footprint to create a set of moving images. So if I wanted to create a walkthrough of my building, I can start myself going up my sidewalk. So I'll just click a camera here to here, click, 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 and that little triangle or those three lines coming off, that's kind of the cone of vision. So I can make it that maybe, I don't know, now I'm just a stumbling lunatic. Click, 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 click. And so I'm just placing different cameras or different frames within my building. You can add frames later on if you want to. You can also directly go through walls and things like that. I try to avoid something like that. And so I'm just placing lots of cameras, and then we'll turn around and look at the building. And now that I have all of my different cameras or frames placed, If I want to, I could check off to not have this in perspective, but I've never made a walkthrough that I didn't want in perspective. And I can also change the offset. So this is just the height that the camera's at. Again, if you maybe wanted it a little bit further up or down, just like with placing cameras, you can change the level that it's on, but I'm just going to leave it at level 1 because I'm on the level 1 floor plan. So it would make sense that I would want the camera to be as if it was at the height of 5'6" on level 1. And so I'm just going to click on Finish Walkthrough, and it now has created a little area in my project browser. If I double click on it, we have my walkthrough. To preview it, and there could be a different way, maybe they've changed it and made it a bit easier. I would hope they'd have. But to preview my walkthrough, I'm going to click on Edit and go all the way to frame 0, or rather frame 1 actually. And that puts me at the first frame. Where'd my edit thing go? There it is. Click on Edit Walkthrough, and then I'm just going to play it. And so it's now just kind of walking me through. Is it a little choppy? Did I just walk through that plant? You bet. And even now when I go through this door, well, technically since it's a glass door, we didn't notice it, but I'm just kind of going around to all of those different cameras and all of those different frames that I placed. I'm going back around, just walking through this glass pane of a door again. The unfortunate thing is the doors don't like animate to open up in the walkthrough. That'd be pretty cool if they did. And then I turn around and I'm at frame 300 looking at the building. If I wanted to slow it down, I can click here on my frame settings and I can make it that there are more frames. So if I change it to be 600 frames in total and I click apply, we can see now that the total time as the walkthrough would be 40 seconds with 15 frames per second. If I change it to be 1200, now it's 80 seconds, and I could change this number as well to say, you know, I want it to be, I want 60 FPS. And I can make it that it's working either faster, slower, depending on how exactly I want my drawing or my walkthrough to be. So if I make it that there's more frames now, it's going to be a longer time. So now I'm moving slower throughout the whole thing. I'm not going to sit and have it play this entire time because that'll be just a waste of your time and mine. But I can kind of slow it down as the walkthrough's going. If I'm previewing the walkthrough and I want to change something, I can just hit escape and it'll say, do you want to stop? I'll just say, yes, I do. While I'm in the middle of editing this walkthrough, I can also go into my floor plan, my level 1 floor plan, and it'll then show me this pathway. This pathway only shows up if I have the walkthrough active and selected. So while I'm in here, I can again click on Edit Walkthrough, and I can change all of these little points. Actually, hold on. No. I can go to different frames, so I can move that kind of camera along. I can change the way the camera is looking, so I can drag it. I can go to these keyframes, and I can edit it. Why won't it let me edit it? I should be able, oh, because I have to drag this part here. Is that what I have to drag? Hello? Are you going to tell me? It used to be that you could just drag these, unless I'm forgetting. Let's say yes, I want to quit editing it. Because I used to just be able to modify the cameras like that, unless I'm forgetting something. Boop-a-doop-a-doop-boop. Uh-oh. I'm having a brain fart. I just also have a lot of cameras placed here, which is making it a little bizarre for me. Um, let's click on it, edit walkthrough. Hmm. Well, hold on. This is going to bug me. I'm going to pause and come back to you guys. Okay, I was right. I just don't know why it wasn't doing it before. So once you have your camera at keyframes, you're going to click on this little target point here and you can move which way the camera is looking at. You can also adjust the where the camera is placed on the path here in the control bar. You can change it to the path options in which we can move where that point is. So if I wanted to alter where it is, and then I can also alter what it's directly looking at. So if I go back into active camera, you do have to be at a key frame point. So it has to be like directly at frame 135. Um, the way that it's easy to get to those keyframes is just to pick on here or here, and then you can alter what it's looking at. And you can also add in additional keyframes. So you can say add keyframe and then click anywhere on your path and add additional frames into it. Uh, and kind of just work your way with that. I'm going to bump that back down to 300 just so it's not an hour and a half long walkthrough, and open it up. And like I said, the only way I know how to preview it is just to click on it and then go into edit, change my keyframe to frame 1, and then come back into edit walkthrough. And you can also put it in like consistent colors while you're doing it, or realistic. Realistic tends to maybe freeze the computer up and potentially even crash the software, depending again on what your computer is and how well it can run. We'll see if mine can do even a realistic walkthrough here, so it's getting a little laggy, but it's going through it. Um, Probably not the best idea that I've ever had, but I also do have the frames pretty low. But I'm just going to hit escape and interrupt it. So I usually will only do a walkthrough in just consistent colors or in um, shaded or even hidden lines. You can have shadows turned on while you do it too, just to try to make it a little bit more realistic. But I don't try to I don't do walkthroughs really to sell like the most realistic thing. It kind of just gives a good look throughout the building without having to have all of the different features in there and make it as realistic as possible, like a rendering is going to be used for. Once you have your walkthrough all set the way you want it to, so if you have a walkthrough done and you want to, whoops, that's not what I wanted to click on, but it's okay. That's just showing me the camera I currently have selected. Um, to export it into like a movie file, again, is just File, Export, hover over that down arrow, Images and Animations, Walkthrough, and then you can export it as a little movie file that you can kind of send along as well, or even make into like a GIF and have that play on like a slide in a presentation file, just so you can, I don't know, have that as another little selling point, another little thing that says, hey, look at what I can do in Revit, and hey, look how cool my building is. Um, and you can change that visual style too, so you can have it where it's a rendering thing, but that's going to be that's going to be a hefty file, and it's going to take a long time to export. So like I said, I usually only will do it in that shaded or that consistent colors. If I do rendering visual style, I'm just curious as to like how long this is going to take to save. if that. Probably very long. So it's sitting here processing this one. This kind of, I guess, the fortunate thing is that that was the last thing I wanted to show you guys for today in this demo. Um, because it'll take forever if it even honestly goes through. I've never done a rendering one. So what I'm going to do is sign off for you guys today, and I'll leave a little note in the description bar of this video. Um, I'll leave a little note there in the description for how long this might have taken to export, because I can only just imagine how crazy long it's going to take. But I'm curious, some of you guys might be as well. And that's all for me today. I'll see you guys in the next one.